What I'm going to try and do is explain what is driving populism, because it's fundamentally influencing the direction of politics, not only in the United States, but almost everywhere in the world today. And people like us, in my experience, don't really get it. I'm going to give you a recipe for populism. It's a sort of Nigella or Jamie Oliver style recipe. It essentially has 5 ingredients. And the first of these ingredients, as you can see here, is a rise in immigration. If you look at data on the percentage of the US population that is foreign-born and go back to the 1850s, you can see that it's not quite true what people say. The United States is a land based on immigration. Well, yeah, kind of, except there was a period when immigration drastically declined. And that began in the late 19th century and culminated in the Depression. It's only in relatively recent times that we've begun to see immigration reach levels like we saw last in the mid-19th century. So ingredient number 1 is there has to be a big increase in immigration. Ingredient number 2 is inequality. So if you look at work done by Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, this is a Saez chart, we can see again that we've reverted in recent times to levels of inequality not seen since the pre-First World War period. So the share of income going to the top 1% is now back up close to 20 to 25% of total income. Ingredient number 3 is the perception of corruption. People have to start believing that the political establishment is corrupt. This chart here is recent data on public approval of institutions in the United States. 8% of Americans have a positive view of the US Congress. 8%. And it's interesting also to see the other institutions that are down near the bottom of the league. The US Supreme Court is pretty near, the presidency just above it. And there's a fundamental sense in the populist conjuncture that established institutions are crooked. The 4th ingredient, you need to add this ingredient to get the populist backlash. You need a big financial crisis. You need a big economic shock added to that mix I've just given you of immigration, inequality, and declining public confidence in institutions. And what I've done in this chart is to show you the 3 biggest financial crises in modern history using the US equity market as the measure. So the green line is the crisis that you've just been through. The peak of the US stock market was October 2007. And with the onset of the financial crisis, we essentially replayed for about a year the events of 1929-30. You'll see that the green and the red lines track together quite closely for about a year. And then we bounced out of that crisis, whereas the Great Depression was characterized by ongoing deep decline in equities. The 3rd line is the one that you'll know least about, because the 3rd line is the post-1873 financial crisis. I bet none of you have ever thought about the events that followed 1873, but you should. Because what happened after 1873 was nothing like as dramatic as 1929. It was a kind of slow burn. The US and the world economy went from a financial crisis, which was driven by real estate speculation, amongst other things, into a protracted period of deflation, what we would probably today talk about as stagnation. And that turned out to be as potent a driver of politics as the more recent financial crises in the chart. There's one missing ingredient that I'm now going to add to the recipe. If I was cooking, this would be the moment when whoomph, flames come out of the pan, okay? You need a demagogue. For populism, or I called it caveman politics in a slightly facetious piece I did for the Sunday Times earlier this year. I used the term in order to try to capture some of what the demagogues do. The demagogues react against all the four things I've just described by making what are typically aggressive, macho pitches to the most embittered parts of the electorate. Now, I love this spoof front page of the Boston Globe that was published in April. It was highly controversial at the time, but I thought it was bang on with deportations to begin. What I liked about it was that it captured the seriousness of the populist phenomenon. You know, when Trump said he was going to run for president last year, my friend, Eric's friend, Arianna Huffington, said she would cover his campaign in the entertainment section of the Huffington Post. This was fatally to underestimate the phenomenon. And in fact, the entire establishment, the people who talk about politics for a living in the United States, underestimated the Trump phenomenon. And I really urge you not to do that. This isn't fascism. It's a grave error to think that Trump is Hitler or Mussolini or anybody of the 1930s vintage. The reason it's an error is it's so obviously not convincing that when people hear the Hitler parallel, they kind of switch the other way. They say, come on, it's obviously not Hitler. And they don't listen to the critique of Trump. I want to suggest to you that a better and more compelling analogy is with the populist movements post-1873. You've probably never seen this guy in your life, and I bet you've never even heard of Dennis Kearney. So Dennis Kearney was the Trump of the 1870s. Kearney himself, an immigrant, an Irish immigrant, was the guy who led the campaign in 1870s California against the Chinese. Kearney's party, the Working Men's Party of California, had as its slogan, "The Chinese must go." I just taught a class on the West and China at Tsinghua. I was in Beijing for 2 weeks. The students were amazed when I told them that there had been a campaign to exclude the Chinese from the United States in the 1870s. This is much more like what we have today than the fascism of the 1930s. Fascism is about guys in uniforms engaging in large-scale systematic violence and then going to war. Populism is not about that. Populism is anti-globalization, it's anti-immigration, it's anti-free trade, it's anti-finance, it's anti the political establishment. Kearney was all of those things. And what people forget when they tell the story of America, the land of immigration, is that Kearney and his ilk succeeded. In 1882, an act was passed that prohibited Chinese immigration to the United States. It was the beginning of a wave of legislation restricting immigration that continued to be enacted right the way into the 1920s and 30s. And it's the reason why you see that decline in the immigrant share of the US population in the mid-20th century. The reason I'm telling you this, apart from the fact that it's fascinating and you probably didn't know it, is that it makes you understand the seriousness of this. Populism is not just entertainment. If you hear somebody say, he says all this in the campaign trail, but when he's president, it'll be fine. And by the way, I hear that almost every day. Do not believe it. Populists have to enact what they pledge in the campaign trail. Otherwise, their followers melt away. Their followers are fickle anyway. In the case of Trump, they already defected from the Republican establishment. If he doesn't deliver, they'll defect from him. I'm a historian. I do applied history. My goal is to try and learn lessons from the past. The lesson of the post-1873 period is very clear. All over the world, there was a massive backlash against globalization. It produced anti-Semitism in Germany as well as in France. It produced a version of this in the United Kingdom too. Very vicious anti-Irish sentiment. I grew up in Glasgow. It flourished there when Irish immigrants became pariahs. And my point is that something very similar is going on today. It is not just about Trump. There are other people with strange blonde hairstyles operating in a country not far from you. And they have, it seems to me, in common, a kind of unscrupulousness, but an ability to tune into the mood of people unlike you, people who don't come to Google conferences. And this is the key problem. We as an elite, and you're all members of the 1%, let's face it, are completely disconnected from the sentiments that the populists are able to tap into. Everybody's underestimated this phenomenon. And the betting markets still underestimate the probability that Trump could become president. 24% last time I looked at the Betfair website. The political experts say he can't win the Electoral College. This is wrong. There's a 50-50 chance Donald Trump is the next president of the United States. All the recent polling shows that they're really closely connected. The most recent national polls going back to Sunday show that it's neck and neck. So we can't underestimate this phenomenon. I've just got time to offer a couple of thoughts as to why we should take this very seriously indeed. The Constitution may well constrain Trump on domestic issues. He won't have a strong base in Congress. The Supreme Court, although he'll get to nominate one justice, will still be an obstacle. But on foreign policy, Trump will have a very free hand, as all presidents do. And the wonderful Lithuanian mural artist who parodied the Brezhnev-Honecker kiss on this Vilnius mural got it right. One of the first things I expect a President Trump to do is to do a, quote, great deal, Trump's phrase, with Vladimir Putin. Anything that Putin is in favor of, you should be against. And Putin is in favor of Trump. A penultimate point. With his call for a blanket ban on Muslim immigration, Trump has, of course, played to the fears that Amal Clooney was talking about a moment ago. The trouble is that those fears have a curious symbiotic relationship with Islamic extremism. Trump and Islamic State represent a fatal conjuncture because all that Trump says seems to reinforce the narrative that the West is fundamentally hostile to Islam without qualification. And that's a dangerous thing. Trump says he'll destroy Islamic State if he becomes president, but he won't say how because, quote, we have to be unpredictable. I don't find that a comforting prospect. If you want to think more about this and hear an even more chilling prognosis, read my good friend Andrew Sullivan's brilliant essay just published a couple of weeks ago in New York Magazine. Beware of the cavemen. They've come out of their caves. And the reason that they're doing so well all over the world is that their fundamental critique of globalization, immigration, free trade, and the rest resonates with substantial parts of the electorate that feel alienated from people like us. Thank you very much indeed.